Mr. Rasika, you can start now. Mr. Rasika, you can start now. It is over to you.
Thank you very much. And very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the research program conducted by the Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka in association with Emerald Publishing and the Gulf Medical University UAE. And this is the 10th webinar of the Writing Impactful Research Program. With a great respect, let me first welcome the speaker of the session, Professor Zubin Sethna from the Regent University of London, Professor Rosalind Jones from Liverpool Business School, Liverpool John Moores University, UK. Today, they are discussing on understanding the methodology and the section for the conceptual papers, which is a timely topic. With a gratitude, let me also welcome Professor Athula Gnanapala, Dean of the Faculty of Management, Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka, and Professor M.Z. Maslam, Chairman of the Research and Development Publication Unit of Faculty of Management Studies of Sabaragamuwa University. And then with the gratitude, let me welcome our regional coordinators of the webinar, Dr. Jayantha Dewasiri, Senior Lecturer of Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka, and Ms. Sangeeta Menon, Publishing Relationship Manager, Emerald Publishing, and Professor Sudhir Rana, Gulf Medical University, and Professor Kasif Zaid, Rift University, Pakistan. In fact, they supported a lot in making of this program a great success. And then with the gratitude, let me also welcome Ms. Disha Lakhanpal, Regional Marketing Manager, Emerald Publishing Group. Then with a great respect, I would like to welcome all the distinguished participants from the Emerald Publishing, Gulf Medical University, as well as Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka. At last, but of course not least, audience, mainly our academics from all the universities worldwide, senior professors, senior lecturers, students, and researchers. You are also welcome to the program for making this session lively. Further, I would like to welcome the media partners of the program, Sunday Observer and Sunday Times of Sri Lanka. At last, but not least, I would like to introduce the main speakers of the program today. Professor Dr. Zubin Sethna is a professor of entrepreneurial marketing and consumer behavior at Regent University of London. Professor Sethna is a qualified marketing practitioner, chartered marketer and a chartered manager, as well as an entrepreneur. He has successfully launched 6 businesses, so one of which won a UK national award also. In his capacity as a managing consultant, in consulting, he has integrated marketing strategies, communication with management consultancy, and training for numerous organizations, both in the UK and internationally, and across variety of industries: maritime, health, professional services, music, travel, manufacturing, retail, IT, education, cottages, industries, and many other more sectors. So this passion for the entrepreneurship and marketing is very evident in his book with Professor Rosalind Jones and Dr. Paul Harrigan, Entrepreneurial Marketing, Global Perspective, which remains the leading text in the entrepreneurship marketing field. His consumer behavior textbook is a bestseller in the UK and Europe. In 2020, the World Economic Forum appointed Professor Sethna as an expert in entrepreneurship, the future consumption, as well as the family business. And he's co-chair of the Academy of Marketing Special Interest Group on Entrepreneurial and Small Business Marketing, and has delivered keynotes at higher education institutes in the UK, Europe, and India. as well as being editor of the chief of the Journal of Research in Marketing and Entrepreneurship. He regularly reviews for a variety of other marketing and entrepreneurship journals, as well as publishing in leading ABS journal. Sir, you're welcome. Professor Rosalind Jones. She's a professor in management and the School of Doctoral Management Studies, Liverpool Business School, Liverpool John Moores University, UK. Professor Ross Jones' research interests including strategic orientation, entrepreneurial marketing, networks, supply chains, and she's co-chair of Entrepreneurial and Small Business Marketing, Special Interest Group of Academy of Marketing, as well as she has won numerous Best Paper Awards, Best Review Award for Emerald Publishers for the Journal of Research in Marketing and Entrepreneurship, and published numerous articles, books, chapters, publishing in globally and internationally recognized business journal, including International Small Business Journal, Journal of Business Research, and Tourism Management. She's co-editor of the Entrepreneurial Marketing Global Perspective. And in 2020, she won the prestigious Professor Gary Hills Award for the most influential paper in the last decade on the topic of entrepreneurial marketing awarded by the American Marketing Association. And Professor is also on the steering committee of the Global Research Conference in Marketing and Entrepreneurship based on US. And her research projects include supply chain development within a large scientific grants on the UK, especially sensing and timing products. So thank you, Professor Zubin and Professor Rosalind. It's all to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind words.
Thank you, Dr. Dewasiri. Very honored to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever in the world you all are. You are all very, very welcome. So thank you for that humbling introduction as well. It's interesting, right, that you kind of, you know, we're all so busy doing all sorts of projects over the years that you forget exactly how much you've achieved over the years. So that's kind of interesting. So people, this morning's or today's session is all about writing conceptual papers. So very thankful to Emerald Publishing for this opportunity and for this series, which has been very, very interesting to say the least. And thank you also to Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka, and also to Gulf Medical University in the UAE for the sponsorship of this of these sessions. So we've got the next 80 minutes or so of a presentation for you, looking specifically at writing conceptual papers. And the kind of session objectives that we're going to be focusing most of our conversation, most of our narrative on, is developing the academic writing skills and publishing techniques for papers with impact. Now, what I'd like you to do just before we kick off is just have a think about the words that you see there in front of you. So developing academic writing skills and publishing techniques for papers with impact. So what does impact actually mean to you? Just have a think about that for 20 seconds whilst I'm talking here. What does impact mean to you? Not only the word impact, but within the context of developing academic writing skills and also publishing techniques. I'm sure you've got some thoughts, I'm going to whiz across to Ros just for a second. Ros, what's your definition of impact here in a sentence?
Producing research that you carry out in whatever context that has measurable outcomes that have meaning for society and for the economy or for the environment.
Perfect. So I'm really hoping, thank you for that. So I'm really hoping that the audience, you know, you're sitting there in your office, in your homes, that your definition of impact has been somewhat along the same lines. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the various methods that we might think about, developing different sections of a paper, and you know its overall structure. So to give you a quick kind of a rundown, then some of the learning outcomes that you'll hopefully take away from today's session. So describing what makes a paper have a conceptual contribution. Okay, we're going to talk about what conceptual actually means and amalgamate that with your specific contribution to the academic community. So we'll start off with that in just a bit. We're going to demonstrate what value conceptual papers can actually create. Okay, what does this actually mean? Okay, so you write a paper, you put it out there. It narrates a conceptual contribution. Okay, but that conceptual contribution needs to be built on, someone needs to be able to derive some value from it in order to build their own work. So we're going to provide you with some examples of how that's been done very, very successfully. We're going to explain some methods of theoretical construction. So not only are you thinking about putting this conceptual paper together, but you're thinking about the widest possible net, if you like, or being able to throw that net out to develop the theory that really underpins the work that you want to do. We're going to explain what makes a paper meaningful to academic audiences. So that's the theoretical construction with the conceptual contribution, creating that value. We're going to delve further into impact, because this is a really, really powerful word, impactful, and it having a paper that has impact is very powerful. So we're going to be looking more at that, and then taking your paper, whether it's a draft or whether it's an idea or whether it's in review somewhere, what's your focus? Is it going to be the theoretical contribution, or is it going to be some form of a methodological contribution, or a mix of the two? Okay, so having done all of that over the next 75 minutes or so, hopefully you will then be able to go away and explain the implications. So whether they are theoretical or they're managerial or whether they're practical. Yeah, so the implications of the impact that your research is going to have on either theory, managers, or practice. And then, of course, no good paper is worthy of its salt unless you've actually outlined the parameters that you're working within. So the study's limitations as well. And undoubtedly, you know, as we're sitting here talking to you and you're sitting there listening to all of these things, I know for a fact that we have all been in that situation where, you know, we have got an idea, we've written an outline for a paper, maybe we've actually written the paper itself, but we've sat there and we've struggled to think about the impact, whether it's theory, managerial, or practical, and how that actually plays out. And of course, you know, as the slide shows there, you know, it happens to the best of us, I'm sure, as we can see Isaac Newton struggling there with his gravity proposal. So let me just move forward. So conceptual papers then. What is a conceptual paper? Ros?
Hello everyone. Yep. So one of the things that most people ask me is, what's the difference between empirical and what's the difference between empirical and conceptual? So a conceptual paper is a paper that you might submit to a journal, and its main thrust of the argument is based in marshalled theory that you've brought together in that paper. Okay, so what I'm finding as well, when we're reading and reviewing a lot of papers for the Journal of Research and Marketing and Entrepreneurship particularly, what we see sometimes are that authors are too quick to get to the data. And I say that to my own PhD students. Don't forget to think about publishing your first conceptual paper from your PhD or from your research project, because you're putting your flag in the sand, if you like, and making a mark if that's got some novelty about it. And then it's good for you to refer to that conceptual paper when you then will be publishing your findings or your results. And one of the things that's very important if you're using quantitative studies is to make sure you have really good conceptual underpinnings linking through, of course, to your measures and constructs. So how does it differ? It's usual to see in conceptual papers literature there to support the framing and analysis, okay, so in terms of empirical data, and you can use field data and surveys, but for conceptual papers very often you don't need to have any findings or data. So have a think about the particular research or paper, as Zubin has mentioned. Have a think about what area of your literature you think has a novelty, or what area you think has an important problem or issue. So to publish a paper, particularly in a top global journal, you need to have a really good question. So what's the question? What's the problem that you have to resolve, and how do you do that? So even for a conceptual paper, that's useful. So you could highlight a problem in the way people see that literature, and that you found something new, or you think we should be considering it in a different way. And you'll be surprised with a new pair of eyes that you have, how much you can see. Even if you're a new researcher, I think sometimes you come in with a complete blank canvas if you're learning, and you can see things that other people just can't see. So have a think about that for a few seconds, and then we'll move on, Zubin.
Thank you. Thanks, Ros.
Okay, so I thought it was really important that we talk about value. So what's the point? What's the point in a conceptual paper? They are highly valued by editors. I know Susan Marlowe, Professor Susan Marlowe from International Small Business Journal, has said to me we get very few conceptual papers, and she wishes that we saw more. Okay, so there's a demand there for conceptual papers. What's required is a rigorous literature review, and I know that you have a training course, another session on literature review. So this literature review will come, that session will underpin this, if you like. So you need to look at that and the details of that to make sure your literature review is good and rigorous and rigorously carried out. And there are different methodologies around that. And then that literature can help you produce a conceptual paper. But it's more than just that. So often a conceptual paper will integrate theory with the knowledge of some context to inform that theory. You have to have a context in order to think about why that literature is relevant, to give you ideas and propositions. So for example, you might be working in a firm or a sample of firms, or you might be working on a particular project. For example, you might have a funded project. So look at that and think, how does my literature apply to this area? So you read the literature that you think is most closely linked to the question that you're trying to answer in the domain that you're interested in, and do what we would call this iterative process of looking at the literature, looking at the context, and going back and forth. So theory, academic theory, can be built and constructed with research evidence. So you can use observation. You can observe individuals, observe firms, look at secondary data, and gather that evidence as part of that process. Okay, and that's useful to mention that in a light touch way. So you're not, in a conceptual paper, you're not putting in a table of people you've interviewed or a survey, but you're saying in your methodology. So don't forget the methodology is different. Your methodology for a conceptual paper is all about how you constructed the theory. So that's very different for us when we're used to, you know, we do the literature review and then we go out and we plan what approach we take with how to collect data, because you're not really collecting data, you're collecting theory, aren't you? And you're building that theory as that iterative process.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about the method later.
It's kind of interesting to note, Ros, I think, that for those colleagues who are listening on this webinar who've maybe never gone anywhere near a conceptual paper, that I'm a big lover of cars, you know, automobiles. I love cars. And so I guess the analogy that I would perhaps proffer to you is to say, well, think about what a concept car is, right? You know, quite often we see the automobile industry and different sort of car manufacturers throw out a concept car, which to the untrained eye usually looks really, really weird, possibly sometimes wonderful, and you know, a lot of the time though, you can't see what relevance it has to the world that we live in currently, right? But of course, to the manufacturers, they can see somewhat ahead. You know, they can see perhaps what's coming in the future. They've taken existing technologies and existing ways of building a car and actually put something together that they believe is going to be the future. And so in the same way, what we're suggesting here is that you as an academic will look at the general body of literature through the kind of literature review. And as Ros has already said, it's more than just the literature review. It's taking the literature and taking the context and turning both of those into some sort of an iterative process that enables you to offer your academic conceptual car to the marketplace here.
Interesting point, Zub, and interesting example. And I think what I'd like to say about that is that as an author of your paper with your conceptual car, this is what makes it difficult, because you have to convince. So these car manufacturers do this to create buzz, don't they? To create future sales, to get the market ready, market timeliness and market readiness. But in terms of this, you have to convince editors and readers and reviewers about why this is important. So that takes writing skill as well.
Indeed.
So I'm sorry I'm croaky. It's because it's early in the morning here. What we call a frog in the throat. So to have impact, try and think of a particular, because this will work better if you've got a particular paper in mind or idea in mind. Try and think what you're highlighting and using theoretical evidence, and it must be new or novel, so something that's not already replicated. Part of that could already be replicated and discussed, but there could be a nuance in that. Okay, and so that's why your context is so interesting, because the context is invariably where you find it doesn't fit, where you see an anomaly, and you think, well, this isn't so. I don't see this happening in this business situation that are reported in these previous empirical papers that have used these scales, measures, investigations, whatever it is they've used. So it's really important to look at that and look at this iterative process. So thinking about examples for you was quite difficult. So the best thing we could do is talk about what we know to explain to you in the best way. And actually, our research that we do, both Zubin and I look at predominantly entrepreneurship and marketing and the interface of that. And so it's actually a really good place to look. It's a very open area for discussion, challenges, and the group of researchers that are in it are generally very open as well to new ideas. I would say that I think some areas of business are probably more closed than others. Some journals more closed than others to new ideas. And unfortunately, we do hear reports that the higher up you go in journals, sometimes it's even more difficult to produce something very novel and sort of out of the box thinking. But I don't think that should upset or stop us trying to do these things. It's really important to drive our research forward and gather these exciting ideas and concepts that stimulate debate. So if we look at interface of marketing and entrepreneurship, where do marketing concepts overlap? So there are papers that look at where marketing is similar to reports on entrepreneurship and where are they different. So there could be a context that you look at and you bring in a different theory with that and think, well, where are the similarities? Where are the overlaps? And by doing that, you can identify gaps. So just have a think for a couple of minutes. That could be an area really worth looking at. What happens then when researchers view marketing from an entrepreneurship theoretical lens? So a lens is a really good term for framing your study. So this means the way that you're looking at this, the angle that you're looking at, okay? And a paper by Hansen and Eggers reports what we call the Charleston Summit in 2010. And this was a group of our, senior group of our researchers in entrepreneurship and marketing. And they met in Charleston in the US, hence the Charleston Summit. And they summarized 4 different viewpoints. So this paper, if you want to look at it, even if it's not your topic, is really interesting, because if you look at this paper, you'll see a way, a method or approach of doing something. So if you're already in a group of researchers in your theme, so perhaps you're all interested in supply chain or you're interested in organizational behavior, whatever it is, have a look at that paper and see if you think it's timely that you hold your own summit. I think that could be something really good, couldn't it, Zubin?
I think that's a really, really interesting point there, Ros. Especially for, let's say, folks who've not approached a conceptual paper before, because it really kind of sets out a roadmap, if you like, you know. So to give you a slight bit of background, you know, I'm going to be talking about Professor Jerry Hills in just a second, but the interface, or researchers at this interface of marketing and entrepreneurship, had for the previous 30 years been looking at the interface, looking at whether it's, you know, a dominance of marketing, whether it's dominance of entrepreneurship, how the two fit together, and, you know, and everything in between. And so by the time we got to 2010, when the then Global Research Symposium in Marketing and Entrepreneurship met in North Carolina, was it South Carolina, in Charleston, this Charleston Summit really brought everything to a head, where, you know, the group basically said, look, we've got this short history of 25, 30 years behind us, and this is what we've achieved, and this is what we think we haven't achieved as yet, and this is the direction that perhaps we need to go in. You know, this is the kind of the future. You know, these are we're mapping out the next 20, 30 years of research activity, you know, and how it's going to impact not just our marketing and entrepreneurship communities, but of course the wider community as well. So again, another analogy, think of it in this way, you know, the global political G7 group met in Cornwall in the UK recently. Okay, what do they think? What do they talk about? You know, well, they did exactly what I've just described happened at the Charleston Summit, where they looked at what they've achieved over the last few years, and they've set out a roadmap for what they need to achieve in the next few years. So, you know, definitely look at the Charleston Summit paper, the Hansen and Eggers paper, and see if you can draw any parallels yourself in your field of research here, and see whether you can do something similar, as Ross says, for sure.
And the references for these papers that we're discussing are all at the end, okay? So you will have those, so you don't need to ask any questions about that, okay? Basically, the whole principle of this is to find new insights that can be gleaned from examining a research phenomenon from a new perspective. But actually, it's well worth, I know we've got professors on the line here, senior professors, well worth looking at summits, because I'm not aware of that many summit papers. And that could be something, there could even be actually from the result of this series, a summit, couldn't there?
Absolutely, absolutely.
On the state of the art of methodologies across India and Asia, for example, couldn't there? You know, it's and it's a benchmark for other researchers to follow and make reference to.
And Ros, you know, you and I have over the last 18 months or 2 years have talked about, you know, similar sorts of trajectories as well. So, you know, folks, we've already said that Ros and I are both into looking at you know, the kind of interface of marketing and entrepreneurship. So that's bringing those two massive disciplines together and looking at that interface. But of course, it doesn't stop there, right? So Ros and I have been talking about, okay, well, how can we take all of our knowledge on entrepreneurial marketing and maybe also amalgamate it with the vast body of knowledge that exists out there in geographic economies, for instance, you know? And let's see what happens when we put both of those together in a chamber. Let's see what kind of explosion, you know, we might find, because undoubtedly there are going to be some interesting concepts that we can draw out from that as well, that are applicable to different parts of the world. So, you know, it doesn't have to be, you know, just the kind of the sort of the marketing entrepreneurship. You can take what you're interested in and throw it together with other aspects of the world around us as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned, Zubin, geographical space, and this came from one of the senior professors at the University of Huddersfield who spoke to us and who had identified in business to business and industrial marketing that geographical space was something, and it was something he was passionate about anyway, because he was interested very much in geography. But that takes me back to the work I've done with Mari Saranta of Finland, and her work when she was in the University of Berkeley, California, where we looked at ecosystems. So we were looking at entrepreneurship and marketing and orientations, and the differences that were highlighted as well. And I'm seeing more and more as we read other people's papers under review, that we're forgetting about context and ecosystems and space. So again, that's an area you might want to consider. And I think authors are concerned, particularly publishing in American journals, hearsay, I think some of it is, but almost being shy of mentioning where the data's collected or the country. And I'm increasingly saying, this is a really interesting country. For example, I was reviewing one the other day from Portugal. They were technology, small startup companies, high growth companies, and that was brushed over in one sentence in the method. And I suggested, well, actually, this is something that you can make a whole point about, and I think we need to think about that as well. It's very important to note how important that is, that we're not all in a mass market and a stable market, and we could be in an advanced economy that's actually in decline. So don't forget to be aware of that when you're doing research, because we're missing things. So moving back then, if we look at these from different perspectives, if we talk about EO and MO, these are often investigated by quantitative studies. So when I carried out my PhD, which isn't that long ago because I came into academia late as being a civil servant and senior manager there when I left. I did an MBA and thought it was so amazing and fantastic and life-changing that I went into academia to follow a research path. So as a process of being placed in a small company with a European funded project, because it's an area of deprivation where I live, it's beautiful countryside in North Wales, but they funded a scholar, so that was myself going into a company where they expected things to happen. I was expected to increase and make an impact by basically selling more products, more technology products as well. So of course that naturally had an impact. I was trying to think how, at that point in doing a PhD, how how do they do this marketing? And I had a project written for me that was there already, and it made no sense. It said, you're going to investigate CRM with a small company and their marketing methods, looking at how they manage their customer databases. And I thought, well, actually, any high-tech company is going to be brilliant at that because they're good at databases. And what's the point of that? So I basically threw that in the bin, and I was lucky enough to be able to do that and say, could we look at something different? Because that's not going to tell us anything. They're good at that. They have wiki conversations. They collect data all the time on themselves. It's something they're good at, but they're not very good at marketing. And they don't know what marketing is because they're a new company. But they do it, but in a different way. So I was spending a lot of time trying to work out what all this was about, and started turning to the library. And after about a year into my PhD, had a eureka moment and found a book all about entrepreneurial marketing. And it was Klaus Hultmann's book, which for us is quite a pivotal book, talking about value constellations and firms, very novel thinking. And I thought, eureka, this is what they're doing. So this is part of that iterative process. I saw the company, I worked in the company, I went with them when they were marketing the company. They were selling software products, the company called Semantize. They were both doctors, the directors, very intelligent. I felt quite threatened at the time because I thought these guys are really intelligent. But I didn't know much about technology, but you don't need to, I learned. You need to know what the product will do for other people and how you sell that and how you look ahead of that to sell it. So, but I looked at these quantitative studies on market orientation, thinking, oh, this looks interesting. And I found a body of research. So if you turn over the slide onto the next one. So my PhD was 2005 to 2009. And surprisingly to me anyway, last year, myself and my supervisor, we won this very prestigious prize that Zubin has mentioned earlier. And it's important for several reasons. One, to emphasize to you how valuable doing a conceptual paper is.
Actually, Ross, I'm just going to stop you there for a second because I just want to explain why Professor Gerald Hills is significant here. Yeah, and just to put it into context, what you're about to say. So, Professor Jerry Hills and Professor David Carson from Ulster University, way back, sort of about almost 40 years ago now, 35, 40 years ago.
1982.
82. There you go. They had this eureka moment. Jerry Hills had this eureka moment of bringing together and wanting to investigate in a lot of detail that interface between all things enterprise and all things marketing, which was, then born into what we now know as entrepreneurial marketing. So that was their conceptual paper. That was Jerry and David Carson's kind of conceptual thinking that has led over 800-900 academics from around the world now to be looking at this particular area. Okay, so all of those 800-900 people who are around the world who specifically look at entrepreneurial marketing, they all recognize Professor Hills as the father of entrepreneurial marketing. They recognize his work on opportunity recognition, or OR, Jerry started the American Marketing Association's Special Interest Group, the SIG, in EM as well, which is thriving today, as it were. And so over the years, then what's happened is that because we recognize Jerry as the sort of the godfather, if you like, of EM, we've also now got a Best Paper Award in recognition of Jerry's lifetime contributions to the field. And so, as you can see on the slide there, the award criteria is quite specific. Okay, it's awarded to the author or authors of the best paper who've made a significant impact on the ME interface research domain. Okay, so the domain nominated articles would have been papers published in the previous 10 years or in any referee publication. Okay, so significant impact. So what we're basically saying is that 800 or 900 people around the world, the community of EM researchers, okay, who know the literature, who understand the impact that different papers in the field have made, and have now voted, recognized, I think probably is a better word, recognized the fact that a particular paper, the nominees and the winners of this particular award have really kind of, and I'm not going to, I don't think it's an understatement, but have changed the lives and the trajectory of those researchers. And certainly I can tell you that Ros's paper, which won the award last year in 2020, did change my life. Just in just the same way as Ros described that eureka moment when she read Klaus's book, you know, and the whole kind of EM concept, you know, came flooding in. Well, based on the work that Ros did with the paper that she's going to talk about in just a second, you know, I kind of then followed that through, and it was my eureka moment as my introduction to the community as well. So, Ros, tell us about your paper then. That's the background.
Okay, yeah, and it's not, I don't mean to be all about myself, but I just wanted to let you know, because I think it's fascinating if you're doing research, that this paper that won the award was one of my first, and it was a conceptual paper. And that's why I thought, hey, this is a really good example to show you. And I think it's also noteworthy to say that Professor Jerry Hills, at the point of him doing this was very much frowned upon, to have interface research. That was not what you did. You know, you had to focus on a domain and stick to it. And so it was brave as well. His work with Professor Klaus Hultman in Sweden gave them a really good sort of balance of entrepreneurship and marketing. Anyway, we're here to talk about conceptual papers, so I'll go on about that. So yeah, this is a little bit, I gathered this data a few months ago, so it's probably changed slightly. So looking at impact, citations and quality, this is what you need to be aware of yourselves when you want to progress. So be aware of creating, put the extra effort in, if you like, extra thinking behind your paper's impact, because then people will run with your paper. It doesn't matter where it's published, as long as it's visible. It'll be, and it's well written, it'll be, oh, that's actually telling an interesting story, or that underpins something I want to look at. You know, it's got to be a trustworthy paper that people can run with, that's really thorough. And that then builds you up citations, so people will read your work a lot and then cite it, because, you know, it's deemed good quality in a good quality journal, but don't necessarily be put off by the level of that journal. So citations, so about 8,500 reads, but that's what ResearchGate picks up. I think it's more than that. 99% or higher research interest than any other on ResearchGate. So ResearchGate is something that we use regularly in the UK. I'm not sure if you do. I hope that you do, because there are international scholars on there. 99% or higher research interest than any other marketing paper on ResearchGate. So my paper on entrepreneurship marketing has actually achieved 99% greater interest than other marketing papers as a whole, which is really indicative, isn't it? And I was surprised when I looked at that. And what was interesting is in this column, if you like, of previous winners, the journal I published in was the International Small Business Journal, which is UK based. And that's the first time a paper out of the US has been selected for this prize, because it's the American Marketing Association and the panel is in America. So I think that's good for that journal as well. And that's the paper there. And also looking at the impact of that journal is interesting. You can see that has quite a high impact for business, what we would call a 3-star in the UK, but a very good 3-star. But again, visibility from that journal has been good. But again, a lot of that is for you to promote yourself. And in the last few years, journal metrics help us to guide us how we promote our papers as well. But I have to say, I didn't really promote this paper much at all. It's just gone out there and been taken by people very quickly as being in the top 3 in the first year most read in that journal. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. We'll get to the point about why this is important. So you may not be interested in entrepreneurial marketing at all. That's not the point of this session. The point here is to show you, imagine or map onto some of the things we're talking about, your own theory that you're working with at the moment, okay, your own context. So I started looking in those early days in the 2006, I would say, battling with what literature there was. I read widely. Reading widely makes you an academic. I know people that have published papers or completed PhD but haven't read widely. That doesn't make you academic, because you can't fit in what you're doing around the wider context and the wider theory. So it's important to know where this theory rests with other theories and where there's conflicts perhaps or different viewpoints. Okay, so anyway, looking at the scales I was looking at, that because the reason I picked up on scales and measures was purely that market orientation seemed interesting, and it was a plethora of research, a big body of research, and well published. And I looked at this and thought, well, this is interesting, but it doesn't fit the context of this small company called Semantize that I talked about. It doesn't, that's not what they're doing. And then when you go into some of these papers, I was then looking at, some of them give you the questions that they ask that underpin those constructs. And some of the questions were things like, do you talk to your customer once a year? Yes. And that was deemed customer orientation or marketing orientation. And you think, well, excuse me, these papers are continually being cited and they're very rigorous and they're very reliable, but are the questions right? I mean, I would argue that we need to be talking to our customers much more frequently than once a year, particularly in technological developments, perhaps, or B2B or industrial marketing. So I think we need to go way back to what we're asking companies for starters. So challenging that assumption. The other thing is, working with this company was that whatever they did was intertwined. So I started looking, thinking, oh, I wonder what else there is about market orientation. What else is there? What other orientations are there? Because market orientation only talks about market orientation. Or interestingly, it talks about customer orientation. And that's very odd, because they actually include, they're interchangeable. They're used interchangeably. So customer and market orientation. So that was interesting to find out. In this paper, I challenge, one of the things that I really have a bugbear about is when you look at small companies that I was working with, in the particular one I was working with at that time, throughout my PhD, they were great at customer orientation because they built relationships, which we find is a common theme in entrepreneurship literature. It's something that entrepreneurs do naturally, really, really good at building relationships. So that's fine. So they're very customer orientated. You can see that at a glance, really. But they're not more market orientated, certainly not the company I was working with, because that would imply market awareness, competitor awareness. And I think there's an awful lot of small businesses who aren't, and particularly companies who have a novel idea. And you'll see it on Dragon's Den, if you ever see Dragon's Den, or Shark Pit, or whichever one you look at.
Shark Tank.
Shark Pit, yeah. Shark Tank, yeah. Shark Pit's the dry one with no water. But you'll see that they have such self-belief in the product, but they won't have actually seen what competitors are doing, what that landscape is. And that self-belief sometimes blinds them to failure, really, because they're not fully aware. So in this paper that's been cited for, like I say, substantially, that's one of the things that sometimes authors have, or readers of the paper, have missed. That's really important. I do think that they're divisible. So scales such as Deshpan, Farley and Webster, etc., they're interchangeably using MO and CO. That's fine, but I do think companies can be very strong on one and very weak on another. And again, suddenly you get the wrong findings, the wrong results. Also, I thought, well, I'll look at entrepreneurial orientation. That's a very big body, again, of literature with very established constructs. That took me, because when I learned from the readings of entrepreneurial marketing, that took me to innovation, because a lot of interface papers with entrepreneurship marketing say that innovation is the third part of a Venn diagram of this, of what's going on. It's disrupting markets because of that entrepreneurial drive. That's what makes entrepreneurial marketing different. Okay, and I found that literature, speed-wise, is slower. It's a massive, massive body of literature. If any of you have looked at innovation, it's huge. And a lot of it's around patent outputs of companies as a measure, but there wasn't much on behavioural. So it's interesting to see the lag behind and which literatures have advanced more than others. So innovation orientation was less formed, shall we say, less known about. So that's a really hot topic if anybody wants to investigate that.
So Ros, can I ask you then? Sorry, I just want to ask you there then. Given that the speed at which these orientations, or the literature that underpins these different orientations, is moving at a different pace, how do you reconcile then this model?
Well, it's probably up for revision. So I know Nicole Coviello, who's well published in entrepreneurship, says, Ros, you know, you're missing a trick. You can go back and look at your papers, critique them, and revisit them. You know, and maybe things have changed. And what's great about, we'll move on to the actual next module. What I wanted to mention in this particular basic framework there with the colours is to say that the important thing for small companies is that there's an overlap, because you've only got a handful of people, so they haven't necessarily got a designated marketing resource until they grow. And that's a very, very, very big area that needs to be researched, is how small companies manage growth. I think it's because it's a difficult thing to investigate, I'm deciding, but that's really difficult for when entrepreneurs get to that stage. They need to be slightly hands-off and get managers in is really difficult. And how do you do that when you're rapidly growing? And if you're somewhere, as I was in North Wales, how do you get high tech or technology people there unless there's a university? Okay, so if we move on to the next slide then. There we go, yes, sorry. So this is very simple. I try in papers to make things very simple, but behind that is a lot of work. Okay, so probably 2 years work, I'd say, in literature review. And we had good reviewers who were in the field and were very helpful in developing our ideas as well. Okay, but when you look at this Venn diagram, you see the shadow in the middle. That's where EM is occurring. My argument in this is that if you're a startup company, you might be more entrepreneurial orientated, mightn't you? So you might be putting more effort there. This isn't deliberate. All this is implicit. Right through the paper, I'm saying, Dr. Oggy East, as the director, one of the directors, they weren't aware they were doing this. This is my observations of them and what was happening, looking at the literature. So different emphasis can be placed on different orientations depending on what you need to do at the time. So if you're on a stable market, you might decide to be more market orientated. Yeah, but if it's a tough climate, like at the moment, probably you're ramping up and you're being more entrepreneurial because you have to be. You may not be as innovative at the moment because it costs more money in investing in R&D. So it's a good model for looking at that and thinking about what it is the company need to focus on. And so this model has been used in other studies quite frequently, or as a reference point, largely saying that in small companies there are strategic orientations, and they ebb and flow, and they're interrelated, and that's the principle really behind this. So what I want to show you next, if we move on to the next slide, is what we're saying. So in small businesses, we know that mainstream marketing textbooks are not applicable to small companies. I see, in terms of marketing, the most applicable that could go into a small business that is useful for them would be consumer behavior, because that's about customers. But when you're talking about trying to embed strategic marketing in a small company, you can't do that. And it also means a high level of long-term planning. In entrepreneurial marketing, we can see that it's best not to always do that, and it's best to be quite flexible and to be non-hierarchical, isn't it? You know, we see this all the time now in larger companies as well. So what we're arguing in this paper, going back to this, and you have to have a really good argument for your paper, is that market orientation researchers recognise firms that adopt other strategic orientations combined with MO are more likely to perform better. So this Grinstein paper was really helpful for me. So I'm saying that yes, we know that it's more helpful, and that's why it's useful to look at different orientations and not just MO alone. Interestingly, this only really is successful, particularly in disruption and during disruption. So in stable markets, the fact that MO is combined with something else as an orientation is less relevant for growth. But if it's a state of flux or very disruptive market, then it's really positive for growth. And these are from quantitative studies. There's lots of literature on this. There are some adapted scales for SMEs, and of course you note those, and those are noted in the paper, and they're very good and they're very statistically accurate. But the thrust of my argument is that scales and measures can fail to capture the overlaps and the distinctiveness of small firm operations and how they're carried out, and we're missing a lot. So for example, in scales and measures, they'll often refer to departmentalism. So the communications within that, well, there aren't departments. So I remember as a PhD student sitting there in I think it was Academy of Marketing conference, and they were presenting how they'd measured and assessed small firms, and they'd just taken non-departmentalism departmentalism out. And so I put my hand up and said, what did you put in instead? Oh, nothing. I thought, well, it's got to be something. And reading our literature that we have in SMEs that is very well established, Carson, people like that Zubin mentions, networking is key, and yet none of the small business scales or measures ever mentioned or asked about networking, and that's critical. So that is an example of where a large body of literature is saying that's how entrepreneurs do marketing, by networking, but nobody had read that or included it in any scales. And so in a way, in a sense, those scales were in ignorance of a large body of literature. Okay, so those are the sorts of arguments you have to put forward. Next slide, please, Zub. So this isn't for every paper, this is in this paper. So if you're doing a conceptual paper, you do not have to do this. But I do know that quite a lot of studies that I've seen coming from India, Asia, etc. are quantitative. So you may want to do this because this is interesting. So what we did, because there was such a dominance of scales, we looked at methodology for can you collapse these scales. We were working on trying to get dimensions, which we were going to use for qualitative study. So trying to get down to the nitty-gritty of what needs to be asked. And so there are ways of doing this systematically and rigorously. Okay, so using Hart and Diamantopoulos, looking at how we can actually reduce and manage those items. And we found research from Hare et al. 1995, very well-known US researcher, and Pazuraman, explaining that you can delete and merge items. So we looked at all the items across a lot of scales, across MO, EO, etc., and we were able to delete and merge some of those for their similarity, what we know as collapsing scales. That might be something you want to do and have a look at yourself, but not for all conceptual papers, just for this one at the moment. Next slide, please. Okay, so we found it helpful to do a list in your method. So this is going into our methods section. Identification of MO, CO, EO, and IO, as discussed above. And then where necessary, we compared with other scales in the same field, so looking at different papers. And then we compared them with dimensions we'd got, looked at these dimensions and any overlap. And these are what you see within those circles on the model. And the allocation of any dimensions that occurred in more than one scale to their dominant orientation, because what happens is a term may be used in EO that's in MO, etc. What we were talking about before, what's similar, what's not. Where is it strongest? Where is it most relevant to that body of literature? And then we look then, or I did because I was the student, we looked at the SME and EM literature in order to look at any omissions, and that was really important to me, so that we don't miss something really obvious. And so here we are mentioning networks and relationships key. And that was included in that model. Okay, next slide, please.
So it sounds as though, Ros, in order to construct a conceptual paper, you're almost having to deconstruct what is available to you already.
That's a really good point. For this particular one, because I was providing a model, there weren't any qualitative orientation studies at all. I don't think we said that that was a contribution, but it's an obvious contribution, isn't it? There wasn't anything qualitative. and actually, I haven't said earlier, but I did think, why are we measuring something in academic marketing terms? Because entrepreneurs are good at marketing in their own way, but may not know the terminology because they may not have done an MBA, or they might be a technology specialist. Doesn't mean they don't do it. They're experts at it. So it's for us to unpick how they do that. So I was really adamant that I wanted to ask them to describe in their own words how their actions, their activities, and their behaviours, and to get their opinions that way. So the framework that I came up with, so that was the Amico framework, which is published in the Journal of Research and Marketing and Entrepreneurship, because I wanted it in the home of where our research is. That I wanted it in the language. I wanted it in the language of those people, and that it doesn't just have to be entrepreneurship. What about other areas you might be investigating? There may be their own choice of words. We make a massive amount of assumptions, don't we? They might say, "Oh, I don't know. I don't." In fact, some entrepreneurs have told me, "Oh, I don't do networking. I hate those things. I hate those breakfast meetings. I hate those." But they're really good at relationships, but they're just perhaps quite shy. They don't want to be into big groups of things. But on an individual one-to-one, they're really good at developing trust. And then that enhances a purchasing decision, doesn't it? Or working together and co-creating something. Yeah. So yeah, it's really dangerous to sort of just go straight.
And I think therein lies another issue, right, that you've identified there, that it's one thing for us as academics to write or want to write a conceptual paper that's going to change the world, or at least our world. But it's another thing to actually bridge the gap which exists between academia, what we do, and the impact that our work will have on managers and practitioners. And so when you talk about, the language that we use, having to or needing to resonate with the practitioners and the managers out there, so that they are able to decipher, in their head, the work that we're actually doing. That's a really, really important bridge. And I think over the years, again, we've seen some great papers that are conceptual, but they're great from an academic perspective. They may not necessarily be great at bridging that gap in order to have real and true impacts. Whereas, and again, I don't wish to kind of blow smoke here, but the Amico paper does exactly that. You can give this to a practitioner, to a manager, and they're able to decipher the words and the language and understand what it means to them. So I think that's a really, really important point there.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we're also not talking much about the method of collecting the data, but I've published on the method of doing that, and I used a card-based method, which I think Zubin would have used for his PhD later. Yes, others have used. And I have published on that with Professor Jenny Rowley, and that's really interesting because you spend 2 years looking at all this theory, and I joked when I went to these companies, because I went to a larger sample of companies, seeing if it was similar in those companies, and I spent 2 years doing this as a PhD student, looking at theory, and I've ended up with 17 cards, and they laugh, but actually you have an interview, you ask them about themselves, and you've got a structure, but then on the cards you've just got the dimension terms which are on this Amico framework, and the Amico framework dimensions the Amico comes from that first model you see there, the 4 circles, but underneath that are descriptors, and those are developed in the Amico framework. So if you need prompts, you can say, but basically you're just handing them a card and it'll say something like, let me think, market intelligence gathering or something like that, and then you let them speak, and it's really useful because you're not interjecting as an interviewer. You let them talk, and they can arrange the cards in different ways. We're going slightly off point, but that might be something that you are interested in doing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so going back to writing a conceptual paper, then assumptions. It's really good if you have a can introduce your literature and then provide some sort of conceptual model, okay, and then have some assumptions on what your argument is based on, so we know, and that's your argument. So this revisiting of that literature, together with the evidence of the importance of networks and word of mouth recommendation and creation of value for customers by way of innovation, suggests that SEO is one of the pivotal dimensions of EM. This stance seeks to embrace the essential nature of EM based on what entrepreneurs and SMEs do in the marketing arena. Okay. We propose that the themes of MO, EO, IO and CO should be embraced, so brought together and integrated within the developing paradigm of EM, while acknowledging that these orientations operate and interact dynamically, depending on the firm's size, market sector and stage of development. So there are hints there for other researchers then to go, great, I think I'll apply this not to high-tech technology, I might apply this to agriculture, or I might apply it to a retail startup, and then I might go into that. I mean, during COVID is another brilliant example of what this might look like now. So lots of interest for people to pick up this paper and think, I can take this, it's trustworthy, and I can apply it somewhere else without question. That formulation, that argument, isn't going to be a cause of problem in my paper. If you see what I mean, it's something that you can trust to use. Okay, next slide, please, Zub. Okay, so look at your research and developing hot topics. So I've done quite a few roadshows recently about publish to get noticed. Okay, so I thought must include this because that's the purpose of writing papers anyway. What are your hot topics? Okay, what are the problems for your economy or your society that you're operating in or that you're observing or researching in? So for me, we have something called areas of outstanding natural beauty. So they're less funded, but they're similar to what we would call national parks. And so I've written a project called Living Landscapes, and it's about rural firm growth and ecosystems. So that's something that could be really interesting in the region where you are. The idea is that some of these areas are 46 areas are protected, and they're protected because of their beauty and their landscape. But that means open access to people. So managing that access to people, which has been interesting in the pandemic, which has actually been quite a problem because we've been oversubscribed by visitors in certain honeypots, as they call it. But also two issues that we have. One is getting food straight directly, so shortening the supply chain so that farmers can sell directly and make more profit that way, and it's better for consumers to buy from their locality. And the other is to have sustainable tourism. So tourism, small businesses that don't impact on the area, that are in keeping with the area, that encourage knowledge about the countryside and about keeping rural traditions and crafts alive. Those sorts of things are really important. And so trying to make that work in a really sustainable way. Now, the AONB's main objective is to improve our environment by working with we have lots of moorland and making sure that that's healthy. So their knowledge base would be environment, most people working outdoors in the hills, you know, and in the mountains. But there's a lot of work going on with the government. And so this research should, in the future, influence government. So they know what's needed, but they don't have the data. So that's something that's very interesting to me at the moment, and we're doing a CCORN funding on that. So that has immediate impact. Okay, and I live in that sort of area, so it's close to home. Okay, so be very precise on your problem definition. I just thought that living landscapes is such a good title, and also I'm doing quite a lot of research with my group of researchers with them in their business planning to make sure that small business, rural companies are written into that plan and it's in the appropriate way, which has happened. Okay. I have to say they were already pretty much on that, to be honest. So what is it that makes your research important? Why does the research community or an associated community, so you might quite often be, say, a paper recently with Philip Alford, we looked at digitisation of SMEs, but it was tourism. So you might have two very distinct literatures in that sense. What existing theory should underpin your study? So an example I'd give you is Morris and Jones. We looked at the Christchurch earthquakes, and it was a small sample of restaurants that were impacted, that were closed, damaged, etc. And we looked at disaster recovery. And that was really interesting because I was asked by editors to go and look deeply into the disaster recovery literature, which I did. And actually that's been fascinating and very relevant for COVID recovery now. So that paper is getting cited a lot. But it also, that paper summarizes it well, so that's why it's getting cited a lot, I think. But think about context, because that's what enriched that paper. Knowing about how disaster recovery has been handled, so not much in business, mainly in communities. So mostly high-level data, nothing granular particularly. So knowing that helps you establish your contribution and what you're saying in that context. And that was I never thought I'd be reading about disaster recovery and putting that into a paper. Okay. Where are those gaps in knowledge? Be really precise. Why has this area been overlooked? Explain why you think it has been. So for me, I would say the reason it's been overlooked is because marketing and marketing orientation scales were developed for examination of large companies in the US predominantly, in stable markets and mass markets, which is completely different. Sort of, it's inverse really, having a startup and starting with one customer and working your way up. So an example I have here is digital adoption with entrepreneurs. So the paper I've written in tourism management recently with Philip is impactful. What we learn gets fed back to these SMEs, and we will go back and measure it for an impact case. They were on a project with Philip and I, and on a previous project with Philip, so we know them well, and they're actually being mentored in using digital, but we're picking up information about them as we go. Okay, so the reason then, by looking at that literature, I went again right through all the literature on digital adoption with entrepreneurs, and it all stopped at the same point. It all got to the point of they need more support, but nothing was after. There's no paper that said we did this and we found that they needed. So in fact, there was one paper, there was one paper, but we really needed to extrapolate that. And the reason that hasn't happened is because people don't do big projects on it and involve them to collect the data. So if you can do something that's almost like action research, and I know sometimes action research papers are hard to publish, but if you do something like that, you can write that in a different way, then that's really good, because out of that naturally comes research and impact, doesn't it? If you see a problem and a business problem and you can resolve it, then that's a good thing. And Zubin mentioned, sorry.
No, go, carry on.
Zubin had mentioned earlier about the gap between business and consultants. And in this paper, to explain what we were doing, I found some research on knowledge. I thought, what are we trying to say about entrepreneurs and how they use digital and how we get them to use it? Yes, it's mentoring, but what are they doing? So I ended up looking at it from a mode 1, mode 2 knowledge acquisition, which was in the literature in tourism years ago. So we picked up on that, brought that back in, and there's a WYSI model in there, you can see, that explains that there is this gap, and that typically small businesses won't access academic research because it's hard to reach and they can't see the relevance, but they'll go to consultants. But typically that is in the community and it is bounded. So the knowledge is bounded in that community in some way, whereas it's proposed, not me, but previous research, proposed that academic research tends not to be like that. It's got a wider view. And so the paper actually ended up more about, okay, if we're going to do this, how do universities do this? How do we do it successfully? And you can see how that's integrated and again, furthers that contribution than more than just learning digital and what they need.
Excellent.
Next slide, please.
That really reinforces the point, right, about the deciphering of the words that we actually put onto paper and how the communities of practice out there, the practitioners, the entrepreneurs actually take our work. But I think it's really interesting. And Ros, I'm going to maybe give your voice a bit of a break just for two seconds.
It's not slow, it's just croaky. Don't know why. I could be doing one of the sort of Tina Turner song or something. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think everything that Ros has talked about so far, it's about putting this paper together and how to actually construct it. But of course, once you've constructed it and you've got it ready to send somewhere, or maybe, hopefully, fingers crossed, as I'm going to come on to in just a second, you've actually written it with a particular journal in mind, as opposed to having written the paper first and then trying to find a journal to publish it, okay? We need to be able to identify journals, okay? So I think the first, and so I'm talking to you with my journal editor's hat on. So I'm editor-in-chief of the Journal of Research for Marketing and Entrepreneurship. Professor Rosalind Jones is one of my associate editors, I beg your pardon, and Professor Susie Morrish down at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand is one of my other associate editors. So we're going to talk to you just for 2 or 3 slides now about identifying the journals for our conceptual papers and why it's so important to get that particular process right as well. So question number 1 is, does the journal willingly accept papers of your type and topic? Okay, because there's nothing more frustrating for an editor than to sit, going through the journal submissions and bearing in mind, we all have day jobs as full-time faculty and academics, and so our journal work normally tends to take place, late in the evening, with lots of coffee or beers or glass of wine or whatever else. And so when we're looking through the submissions, and if you're not familiar with the way that this process works, one of the first things that the editor normally does is to do a desk review, right? So literally, submissions come in, I'll kind of whiz through them to ensure that they have some fit or some relevance to my readership, the people who actually buy and subscribe to my journal. Are they going to be interested in this potential piece of work here? Okay, so the desk review is the first process. And if I see that there's an article that's been submitted or a manuscript that's been submitted that clearly doesn't have any relevance to my journal, it gets the reject button straight away, without even going out to review. So you guys need to think about that, when you're thinking about, sending out your paper, your manuscript to a journal somewhere. Do they accept your type of paper and topic? So it's kind of a topsy-turvy process here, okay? But reading the journal's scope and the journal's editorial board and the review board members, and actually crafting your manuscript. This is where I'm saying you need to actually do some of this stuff before you actually even write your manuscript, because you need to be able to craft your narrative so that it's going to be interesting not only to the editor, not only to the associate editors, but the editorial review board as well, i.e. the folks who are actually going to review your manuscript, the folks who are the experts in that subject area. And so if you're, and the whole point about an academic paper, whether it's conceptual or empirical, is that you're adding to the academic debate. You're not just adding, but you're engaging with that academic debate. So on the basis that you're wanting to engage with the academic debate, why would you not then engage with the narrative that the editorial review board members and others have published in that particular journal and debate with their academic point of view, whether you agree or disagree? Yeah, does that make sense? So, you know, you need to be able to look for discussions in that journal about your topic. So who else has said anything similar, or who else is debating in that area, and look at which journals readership is most likely to be interested in what you have to say. Okay, so you know, it makes it a little more difficult, perhaps. One perspective is that it makes it difficult where you've got a multitude of different research areas. So when you're, for argument's sake, you know, the entrepreneurial marketing, a paper or manuscript on entrepreneurial marketing, well, where's that likely to go? Does my paper have more of a leaning towards entrepreneurship, or is there more of a leaning towards marketing? And then depending on which way the leaning is, I'll find a journal that's going to be appropriate, you know, either entrepreneurship or marketing. But that's all the kind of regular issues. What we also know, of course, that all journals, most journals, will have a call for papers from time to time for special issues. Okay, so these sit outside the regular publication schedule that a journal has, and it usually is for a focus or a spotlight on a particular niche issue that journal happens to be interested in. Now, sometimes it's the editors who will conjure up a topic that they're kind of interested in, and they think it's new and sexy and whatever else, and put a special issue call for papers out there. Sometimes those call for papers are associated with a conference of some description. So if you're presenting your paper at a conference, it's also useful to know, you know, what journals are associated with that, and that might be a route to publication there. And you know, there's a couple of examples there on the screen. So the Journal for Business Research. Was the disaster recovery a special issue, Ros?
Yes, that was in a special issue of Entrepreneurship and Marketing, wasn't it?
Right. Absolutely, yeah. So you need to start reviewing for journals as well. You know, again, part of engaging in the academic debate and understanding what the debates are out there, even before they get published sometimes, you know, by putting your hand up and saying, yeah, I'm happy to review a paper for you, editor, Mr. Mrs. Editor, you know, gets you to figure out sort of, you know, from you know, look at behind the scenes and see what kind of papers are potentially coming to marketplace. But it also gives you, you know, if you're reviewing papers that are in your area, it also kind of gives you knowledge about papers that you may have missed as part of your own lit review as well. So enlightening in many, many ways there in order to develop your knowledge and expertise. Anything to add there, Ros?
Yeah, so one of the good things about reviewing as well, when you will get a reply from the editor, so for example Zubin, and a decision that goes out to the authors, but you will see other reviewer comments. That's always a useful way to learn. One other thing worth mentioning is there are professors that advocate sometimes putting something in the journal and bringing something new by going to a completely different journal with your theory. So your theory might not have been, I'll give you an example here because it's easier. I have a completed PhD student who's an academic anyway, and Dr. Richard Oddy, and his interface, he found me because of that conceptual model. He liked the principles, and he went on to look at small golf clubs. So he's in the sports arena, pardon the pun, with entrepreneurship. But what's interesting there is perhaps we're looking at taking this into perhaps some of this work into sports, because there are calls there for there's a lack of knowledge about entrepreneurial businesses and support for small sports clubs, and again that's a international problem. So sometimes that creates an opportunity for you as well, where we do tend to work in silos, don't we? So you can bring something new to a different context.
Absolutely. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to whiz through the do's and don'ts of publishing your conceptual paper in a journal somewhere. So let's look at the do's to start with, okay? So if you're working on your PhD, publish whilst you progress, not at the end. Getting feedback from researchers at conferences to develop your work and insights, really, really important, okay? And the only thing I'm going to say about that one particular point, okay, is that if you've published papers or a book chapter or conference, peer-reviewed conference papers along the way, it's going to be a very, very brave examiner who potentially fails you if you've had work that's already peer-reviewed and published out there in the academic domain. Okay, and of course, you know, as the slide says, you know, it's really useful to get that researcher feedback as well, okay, along the way. So do ask others and read and give constructive feedback on your work before submission. Okay, time and time again, you know, I get extremely frustrated where it would have been a really simple fix for a author to have just, you know, sent the paper out to a couple of their academic mates and said, hey, listen, can you just give me a fresh pair of eyes, please? Does this read well? Is there a flow? Does the structure sound, you know, okay, kind of thing? Or maybe even, if English is a second language, you know, and, you know, look, I kind of only speak English and a bit of Hindi, I guess. But if I had to write a paper in Hindi, I'd be completely lost, as it were. And so sometimes you think, okay, well, you know, before you submit your manuscript to a journal somewhere, is it going to be deciphered by the editor and the editorial review board in the way that I need it to be deciphered? Okay, so proofreading, you know, maybe even a professional proofreader, you know, and I know Emerald, you know, have a service for professional proofreading, which is well worth looking at, you know, before you submit your work, because again, you know, sometimes I'll actually see the merits in a particular paper and I'll send it out to review, and the reviewer comments, you know, will come back saying, yeah, really interesting paper, but I had to spend hours really digging deep trying to understand what the author was saying because it just wasn't coherent, you know. So need to kind of really focus your mind and ensure that, you know, all the kind of the structure, the referencing, the style are all exactly what the journal have asked for. Make a clear statement about why and how your research is important, and do that right at the beginning. You know, set your stall out. You know, when I go to the market on a Saturday morning, the local market, and I see the stalls, I know very clearly where the cheese stall is, where the coffee stall is, where the meat market is, where the fish guy is. You know, there's no ambiguity, is what I'm saying. So set your stall out here and tell the reader exactly why your research is important and how you've constructed this this manuscript that they're about to read, and where the problematization of your study is. Okay, in the introduction, refer to the discussions in the journal by way of the introduction. Mention the key commentators who have commentated in this area in that particular journal over the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years, so that you can show the reader and the editor and the review board that you are actively engaging with that academic debate, you know. But top tip here, what it also shows the editor is that if you've quoted, let's say, Ros a number of times in the introductory paragraphs of your paper, clearly I can see that actually you're trying to engage with Ros in the academic debate. So guess where I'm likely to possibly send the paper for review? You know, to that author who's commented in that specific area. So again, it helps to explain the strengths of your study and what the paper sets out to achieve. And do read how the work is presented in that journal. You know, a colleague of mine some years ago said to me, when I'm writing a paper for a particular journal, what I will do is pick out 4 or 5 papers that have been highly cited from that journal over the past few years. I'll print them out in the days when we did do stuff like that. I'd print them out and I'd put them all out in a big table in front of me, and then I'd start to write my paper and craft it so that I could actually visually see the kind of style that these other papers were written in, because clearly that's a style that the journal likes. Yeah. Ros, anything to add to that one?
Yeah, so if you look at the last point on the slide I wanted to mention, I learned a lot when I was writing the Journal of Business Research article, and comments from the editors, very good comments, made me investigate further and opened up what I called Pandora's box. In fact, I think the editor referred to that. And I went to look at how different editors of journals describe how to write in journals. So don't be afraid to look at, there's quite a few papers on from editors saying what not to do and what to do. And I've enclosed one at the end as well for you to look at, to read. Using theories in use was useful for me. That's not conceptual, but it was useful to explain empirical data. So, but do take a look. There's a body of research there about how to publish. So take a look at that. Next slide, please, because I know we need to talk about structure as well.
Yeah. Okay. So very quickly, the don'ts of publishing. Okay. So this is what you do not do, people. Okay. So you do not ignore the key literature that's relevant to your topic. Okay. Because the editor knows the literature, the editorial review board knows the literature, and the reviewers know the literature. Okay. And if you don't quote it, if you don't engage with it, your paper ain't going anywhere fast. Okay. So look at the editorial review board, look what they're publishing, or where they're publishing, and take it from there. Don't provide a cursory reply to reviewers on revision. So if your paper is lucky enough to make it through the desk review process and goes out to review, and your reviewers, 2, 3, 4 of them come back and give you some direction as to how to improve your paper, okay, and you're given either a minor or a major revision, okay, don't just provide a cursory reply. Engage with it. Provide a letter. Put a table together addressing each point. You know, show your passion and commitment and accuracy, and acknowledge the fact that the reviewers, you know, most times spend hours looking at your paper, reading it, rereading it, and trying to give you some direction to make it even better than it already is. Okay, so by providing a cursory review, a cursory kind of reply, you know, you very often will frustrate the reviewer, because once you've done your revision, odds are that manuscript will go back to the same reviewers. Okay, and so they need to see that you've actually taken on board their commentary. And if you don't want to take on board their commentary, that's okay too. But tell them politely why you disagree. Further engage in that academic debate and acknowledge that, you know, you acknowledge that, you know, what their concerns actually are. And yeah, if you're going to criticize anyone, then yeah, of course we can. That's our prerogative as an academic, but make sure you do so on very, very solid ground. Because for every one criticism that you levy against a theory or a person, there are going to be 50 others who will jump down your throat to tell you why you're wrong, basically. Okay, Ros?
That's fine. Over to the next slide.
You know, great stuff. Okay, so over to you, Ros.
Yeah, I'm leaning forward here because I haven't got my glasses on, folks. So don't think I'm being intimidating. So you really need a clear contribution. So a critical review of the theory, provision of a conceptual model or framework or set of research propositions. So this can reposition or advance research in your area. So that's what I would do. I didn't do this at the time, I have to say, as a PhD student, but with what I know now as a professor, I would tell you that the best thing you can do is to think about propositions. So that means somebody can take forward a quantitative study based on your paper, for example. So think about whether you can do that. And that's a really powerful way of advancing your paper, taking literature and again, moving that flag up in the sand a bit further. Okay, so propositions can follow presentation of empirical data or theory alone. Okay, so that's absolutely fine. And if you want an example, you can look at Jones and Morris, that's empirical data, but it gives you an example of how those are developed using theory as well. Empirical data collection needs a robust methodology, and the novelty of contribution can be the way the analysis is carried out. For example, template analysis. Alford and Page have a look at that. That's quite a new way of carrying out analysing qualitative data taken from a different discipline. You can make a clear contribution by the comprehensive nature of how the methodology is explained. Looking at justifying and negating arguments, and often you end up doing that following a reviewer telling you that. You can see sometimes when a paper's been pre-reviewed because the arguments are almost so strong and you think, oh, that's odd. But try to do that. Try to negate arguments in your paper before we get it, or before your editor gets it. If publishing for US journals, you may experience that qualitative research needs to be presented in a positivistic way, and that's where that led me to looking at other papers, Roy Sotheby being one, a very interesting way of how we present for readability, simply because they're more used to reading positivistic papers. Next slide, please. Sentence and structure, which was one of the main themes in this presentation. All those other things we've needed to say are really important. Structure is important, sections are important. We can't really be prescriptive about what that looks like because it depends what you're presenting, but we can give you an idea here. These are my suggestions. So when you've chosen your target journal, as Zubin said, read the author guidelines carefully first. Find one or two similar types of paper in that journal, print it out and look at it and copy that format. If that's obviously what's been used earlier. I find that useful. Conceptual papers will have an introduction. They will have a literature review with subheadings, presumably, on the topics. And then there'll be a section of new knowledge, won't there? You may have a methodology section if you're doing something complex like collapsing scales, as we did in the EMO paper. Okay. And then presenting a conceptual model, that could be in a separate section because you might want to explain assumptions of that model. I think that's really important. And the discussion of the implications of that model. Okay. And how this would be applied. You might have typologies. You might decide to synthesize the literature and discuss, have a table of typologies, for example, that are relevant to your field and what this tells you about future research. And the conclusion should include limitations and these implications we've talked about of society, of environmental or economical, predominantly society and economical for business research. The argument for your new proposal should be carefully made and crafted. Okay, next page. Present sufficient data and tables. Okay, we need to see those. We need to see that body of work, that it's not just plonked into a paper. We need to see, it's lovely to see really rigorous work, and that gives us confidence. And if it's a pivotal model like a conceptual model, then that would be in the main body of the paper. Anything else, Zubin, there?
No, I think that's just you're telling a story essentially. Your narrative. You're telling a story here, and that story, to take it down to kind of basics. When we were at school, in primary school or kindergarten, when we were taught how to write a story, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So why shouldn't a paper? Why shouldn't a conceptual paper? And quite often, the desk rejects that I send out, have one or two parts, but not all three parts to that story. You know, they'll give me a beginning, they'll give me a middle, but I'm left hanging for the end, you know. And so what do? Do I make up my own conclusions there? Or, you know, or we have a beginning and we have an ending, but there's very little in the middle to actually justify the paper going through any further. So think about, you know, when you're explaining your model or framework, you know, you need to do so in totality.
Yeah, and what you've done at the introduction, go back, it'll change as you go along. So make sure that in the conclusion, you've covered what you said in the introduction. Sometimes you might need a summary section if you're pulling a lot of literature together. Take a look at a few other papers as a conceptual to give you an idea. Is that the last slide? I'm trying to remember.
No, there's one more after this. So if you talk to the impact, I can take the next one then. Yeah. So impact.
Okay, so we have REF in the UK. So our universities submit papers. We did this in 2021. It's every 7 years. So our focus is increasingly, the government focuses on impact of our research, and our universities will be funded because we want to be impactful. So we're moving much more closely to that. So over the last few years, that has changed. So I'm not sure about it in terms of your country context, but I would argue it's probably going to be very similar. I think I sense it's slightly different in US journals, but it's a good way to work because it means that your work is valuable and you're creating some change and difference in the societies that we work in. So I think it's a very positive thing to do. Look at contributions for the study, and you could look at advances of new knowledge of theory by justifying and answering the so what question, what's important, to convince reviewers. You could provide a new set of propositions, a conceptual framework, or empirically informed model. You could explore the implications of entrepreneurs, managers, investors, stakeholders, business or destination marketing organizations. There might be implications related to that. They could be practical and managerial implications. So think about that. I like to produce papers that can be used and applied in context, which they are. And look at exploring the implications of government agencies and policy delivery, for example. So an example of that would be Hayworth, Thomas and Jones, where we looked at stroke survival and entrepreneurial clubs that had set up because there was little government support and how that met that unmet need. So that was the association between governments and social policy and the community. So I think communities of practice are very interesting to research as well, aren't they? And so
Absolutely.
Some ideas there for you.
So people, after what is it, 70, 80 minutes of talking, our final slide then really talks about, if I can, just a little summary here for you then. So publishing your conceptual paper in top journals, read the literature carefully and don't be afraid to critique it. That's in fact part of the job. Okay, challenge the dominant assumptions that are out there in helping to justify and your own work. But in justifying your own work, be sure of your ground. You know exactly where you're standing and where you're walking, and therefore know your literature well as well. Because when it comes to a conceptual paper, if you omit something that really should be in there, that's a lot less forgivable in this particular space. Use up-to-date articles. It kills me every time I kind of read what is seemingly a good paper, but where the literature is somewhat dated, and that just shows me kind of sloppy behavior. So don't do that. Look at the articles that have been published in world-class and international ranked journals, but also all the very kind of good business journals out there. And then lastly, really make sure that you're linked to research platforms like ResearchGate, so that really you're up to date with the various discussions and publications on your topic, because everyone will post their stuff up there as they're publishing.
And Twitter and LinkedIn increasingly. So we haven't put our details on there, and I've only just moved from University of Birmingham to Liverpool. So, but look for us on LinkedIn and Twitter and connect with those people that you're really interested in researching. And there's a link there at the top I've put in there that's a Guardian UK journal newspaper about how to publish, and some of the papers we've talked about today. So hopefully they'll be helpful. But do contact us if you have any questions. And we haven't left much time, I'm sorry. That's the danger of putting me and Zubin in one screen.
So thank you very much, Professor Rosalind Jones and Zubin Sethna, for your insightful session. It is indeed an eye-opening session for all of us. So now the forum is open for the questions. So I'll read out the questions. The first question: what is the key difference in the methodology section of a qualitative conceptual paper and quantitative conceptual paper?
Ross.
Okay, the key difference is that if you're writing a quantitative paper, you will be talking about development of your hypothesis, and you will be talking about development of your constructs and which constructs you're using, which measures you're using. And we look at that very closely because sometimes they're used without question, and sometimes the adaptation isn't fully explained. So if there is a small adaptation. Conceptual methodology, you're explaining purely your methodology for drawing that information together. So how you went about that. So if you look at my EMO paper, you will see how that's done. It will vary. You might have explained a context. You might have explained an iterative process of gathering the theory, or you might simply have covered that in your introduction and be able to go straight into discussing the different theories, how they interrelate their differences, and how you've gone about doing that, how you've synthesized that. So if you're developing a typology, you might talk about how you did that, or if you're collapsing scales, you might talk about how you did that. I think it's very different per each one, but yes, you're not talking about method for collecting. You have to forget about collecting secondary or primary data. That's obviously nothing to do with it. So you're just, it's a shift in thinking. So you're just talking about how you rigorously looked at that literature.
So thank you very much, Professor Jones. The second question: sometimes the context of research can vary depending on the timing and the nature of the audience. How do we address that?
The nature of the audience, I don't know, I don't fully understand that. Do you mean the way you present it to an audience?
Yes, so sometimes the context of research can vary depending on the timing and the nature of the audience. How do we address that?
I'm not sure about how you mean by audience there. If you mean you have to present it in a different way, I think we do that quite a lot in presentations, certainly. If you're talking about using theory and applying it in different settings, yes, it does vary, and that's the interesting thing. So you would just be setting it in a context that's relevant. So you might think about, I don't know, internationalization, and that might be an interesting way of looking at this literature and how it's relevant to that. If you're talking about different audiences and what they're going to pick up as interesting, then yes, you can hone it towards that audience.
Thank you, Professor. The third question: how many papers it should read before you start to write conceptual paper? General question.
There's no answer to that, Dr. Dewasiri.
Well, mine was for my PhD, but nobody counts. But what you need to do, that's a good question actually. Go into Google Scholar. Presume you all have Google Scholar. Have a look and see how often things are cited. So you will know the most popular accepted papers by their citations. That's not a good judge if it's recent, because obviously if it's recent, there'll be less citations. So you take that into account. So if you look at EO or MO, you can see the ones most cited because they've got, you know, thousands of citations. So you know that those are accepted. So that's a good way of knowing the strongest literature in that area that you need to talk about. So you can say there's a plethora of research about this. There is a body of literature about that. And you can cluster together the conversations in the literature and where there are commonalities. So for EO, it's risk taking, proactiveness, those sorts of things that often relate to constructs as well. But you may not be looking at constructs. I happen to be, but you might just look at the sorts of topics that come up, the assumptions. So risk is a big one, like I say, and proactivity, those sorts of things come up regularly. So there's an agreement, and it's good to say in a paper, there's an agreement about this, and there's agreement about this, and there's discourse about this. However, there's a lack of knowledge on this or something, or there's a disagreement about this.
The only caveat I'd kind of add to that as well, Ros, if I may, is to say that, yeah, it's Ros is absolutely right in terms of those papers that have, you know, high citation scores. But of course, you know, if you're looking at something, an area that's very, very, very niche, you know, there might be papers that have been published in very specialist journals that haven't been, you know, read widely, but are still of interest to that very niche academic community, you know. Don't forget about those either.
Okay.
That's true. And another good way of doing this is there might, Zubin had mentioned talking about the topic in the journal, but sometimes, for example, with the mode 1, mode 2 learning, this was like from like decades ago, it was mentioned somewhere and in a chapter, and you think, wow, that's really good. So don't be afraid also saying we need to reinvigorate this argument and bring this in. This is really interesting. So, you know, or it's been, I've seen this in another journal and this is really relevant, and so you can do that.
So thank you very much for your comprehensive answers. So the last question, I think, so we can't take more questions. It is indeed an interesting question. 1 minute.
The big one.
No, not big one. Not a big one. Can conceptual papers be written alone? There is a trend of writing with huge bibliography, which becomes difficult for an individual working alone.
Yeah, it's good to do it together. So that paper that I was talking about this morning or this evening, I had a supervisor. She wasn't in my field of research, which was a challenge in a way. But on the other hand, she would always be devil's advocate, you know. So we'd sit in her office and we'd go through things and sort of argue and discuss. And I think that's a really good point. I think that you can and should do that. Definitely.
So I think we can go for another question. What are the steps to get more citation to a concept paper?
Write something brilliant. Do all those things we've just told you to do. So sorry, I shouldn't be flippant, but what you need to do is think of the contribution. Something that you think people will be really interested in, that and provide something in that paper that's easy for other people to pick up. It's simple in its concept and there's no ambiguity, and then people can run with it. People like that conceptual model that I've got there because you can see that. I think that makes sense, doesn't it? It's something you can take and put in different contexts. It's or what's said in the paper. Quite often it's not the model, it's what I've said in the paper about, usually about strategic orientation and the way that it's interactive in a small firm gets cited the most. So have a hook for that paper that people are interested in. And as Zubin said, make sure you mention in the abstract those keywords. Make sure your keywords are correct, that are relevant as well, not related to the context, but are more pivotal to the theory. And then keep that common theme going in there. Pick up on what people have missed and why it's important.
You know, another way of looking at this is for the audience that's listening to this right now, is for you guys to ask yourselves in your research domain, what are the big concepts that you can list? You know, so if you had a bit of paper and a pen and you had to, you know, so I'm in the marketing and entrepreneurship field. If I had to, over the next 10 minutes, list all the big concepts that I'm aware of, you know, why am I aware of them? What is it over the last whatever, 30 years of my academic or 20 years of my academic career that's made me aware of them. What can I take out of those? And therefore, what kind of contribution would I want to make that potentially somebody else writing their list in another 20 years' time might remember?
Yeah, don't be afraid to use new terms. So I smile when I use terms in my thesis and my publications, and then because I present it, and that's another thing we should say, by presenting, I was getting feedback. So when I first presented my early EMO sort of thing, which was very early thoughts, I met Jerry Hills. My knees were knocking, you know, as a PhD student of nerves. And he just went, well, this drawl, this under, well, Rosalind, no one's ever thought of measuring it before. So there you go. That was confirmation that I had something interesting, and it was received well in that area. So it's good to be careful with your ideas in case they're imitated, but it's good with trusted people to sound them out. And with time, things change. I think digitization, for example, times change, don't they? With country growth as well, growth of economies, things change, don't they? So what might have been relevant for 2 decades ago may be different. So you can say it's time to revisit.
Yeah,
it's time to revisit this area because this was then, and you know, there's so much now with people researchers haven't looked at with digitization, for example, or internationalization.
and I think actually, Ros, you just touched there on a previous question that was asked in terms of should, you know, how far should we be cognizant of the different audiences that, you know, that we're writing for. And I think therein lies the point about this change in, or the sea change, if you like, in economic growth, you know. And so what may have been relevant to, and I hate using this word, so please forgive me, but, you know, what may have been relevant to kind of Western audiences over the last, you know, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, you know, and stuff that has been tried and tested. Of course, it's been tried and tested in a particular context. That doesn't mean that it's going to be applicable to, you know, to growth economies, or, you know, kind of the way that we see the world shifting, you know. So maybe it's time that we actually went back and, you know, and looked at that tried and tested stuff to see if, you know, it makes sense to the audiences that we're communicating with now, and whether they're actually able to decipher it in the way that they need to, want to, and, you know, yeah, maybe let's leave it at that before I start getting too political.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Ross and Professor Zubin, for your great contribution today. So now I would like to invite Ms. Sanduni Dilanka to deliver the thank you note. Ms. Sanduni, it is over to you.
Yeah.
Sanduni, can you hear us? Is it audible?
That's okay. She will reach out. Thank you so much, Professor Zubin and Professor Ross. It was indeed very, very good discussion.
You're welcome. I'm sorry it's not more interactive, but with over 500 people, it'd be a bit difficult. And I can probably still talk all over you anyway, as Zubin will know.
So, as the final remarks, I would like to deliver the thank you note, Sudhir. So,
sure, please.
So it is my privilege to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on behalf of the Gulf Medical University, Emerald Publishing, and Faculty of Management Studies of the Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka, and on my own behalf, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to the main speakers of the session, Professor Zubin Sethna from the Regent University London, and Professor Rosalind Jones from the Liverpool Business School, Liverpool John Moores University, UK. It is indeed an inspiring and eye-opening session. At the outset, I would like to express my profound gratitude to the Faculty of Management Studies of the Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka, headed by Professor Athula Gnanapala. In addition to that, I would like to express my special gratitude to Professor M.S.M. Aslam, Chairman of the Research and Publication Unit of the Faculty of Management Studies of the Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka. I would like to express our sense of obligations to regional coordinations for their kind guidance for this event. In particular, Ms. Sangeeta Menon, Publishing Relationship Manager, Emerald Publishing, Professor Sudhir Rana, our friend from Gulf Medical University, and Professor Kasif Said from Gift University, Pakistan. In fact, they supported a lot in making this program a great success. Then with the gratitude, let me also thank Ms. Disha Lakhanpal, Regional Marketing Manager, Emerald Publishing Group, for the support rendered in making this program a great success. Then with a great respect, I would like to especially thank all the distinguished officials from Emerald Publishing, Gulf Medical University, and the Sabaragamuwa University of Sri Lanka. At last but not least, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the audience, all the senior professors, senior academics, visiting faculty, researchers, industry participants, partner university representatives, research students, and media representatives, including Sunday Observer and Sunday Times, for their active participation. Thank you all again. So we will meet up again next week. So the next week's session will be delivered by Dr. Subhashi Nag. She is a senior solution consultant from Clarivate Analytics, which is Web of Science. She will be discussing on how to take your research to the next level. So wish you all the best. We'll meet up again during the course of next week, next Thursday at 12:30 p.m. Good luck. Bye-bye.